So go ahead, Allan.
Yeah, I'll be covering new features we have in 5.7 and new features we'll be having in 5.8. And I'll show a bit about some configurability options we have, some more or less secret options. I'm originally from Denmark, working in Berlin, and maintain a WebEngine. That's the agenda. So let's start with 5.7 that came out in June this year. The first thing I'll be covering, which we'll see in a slide later, is the support for Netflix and similar services, and isolated JavaScript worlds and printing. I'll get back to these three topics in detail later. Also new in 5.7 was the support for drag and drop, the normal desktop feature, drag into and drag out of and drag inside. And one of the more or less secret options is the Mac App Store compatibility, and that comes from the Mac OS Store not allowing certain private APIs to be used. And of course, Apple have used those APIs in WebKit, which means they're used in Blink, which means they're used in Chromium. So any project that was based on these things end up having features that Apple didn't allow in their own App Store. But we've been able to remove them. And they're very minor things. There's something called like kill ring, which is sort of an Emacs yank thing that nobody ever uses anyway. And there's some theming where it looks more native if you have it enabled. So by default, it's not Mac App Store compatible, but there's a compile time options to make it now. Another new feature is Signal on WebEngine pages, where they can show that it's emitted whenever there's audio playing on a page, and that is of course used in browsers when you have multiple tabs and you want to show the user which tab is making noise. They can show that, and you can also mute WebEngine pages separately that way. And finally, in 5.7, we got sandboxing enabled on Linux and OS X. As you might notice, there's something missing slightly there. It's Windows, and it's not because we already had sandboxing on Windows. It's because the Google way of implementing sandbox for Chrome on Windows is not very good. And basically, it only works if you have statically linked libraries, and you have the same, and the sandbox and the sandbox E is the same executable. Basically, it's completely unworkable with WebEngine being a library, and we have to rewrite that. I've been hoping for Google to fix that themselves, but it apparently is something we will have to rewrite soon if you want sandboxing on Windows. In 5.8, we will have more printing. We'll go back to that and spell checking. We'll come back to that later. We'll have extensions to user scripts using a new scene graph and custom QML controls. All of those things we'll be covering later in details. The two last small features is we now have support for certain Chrome paths. Most of these, if you use Chrome browser, sort of their way of implementing dialogues. For instance, their settings is a Chrome :/settings. And of course, we can't use those because they're all specific to the Chrome browser. They don't necessarily make sense for all user applications, so we don't have those. But we have a few, now in 5.8, we have a subset of those that work. And the most important of this, the GPU one. This is a page that will show you which hardware accelerated features are enabled, which things are hardware decoded, and which are not. And because Chrome has a blacklist of specific hardware and drivers and combinations of drivers and hardware, and will disable features based on that, it can often be difficult to tell why is this particular video not hardware accelerated on this computer when this computer that is older, it is. And by going to this page, you can figure out why something is hardware accelerated or not, what blacklist item it has been triggered. And finally, we have the view source scheme also, which is just like HTTP, except that it renders things as plain text instead of rendering it as HTML. So let's get to the first of the new features in 5.7. I've combined two things here, the proprietary codecs and the Widevine. Oh, yeah, I've been told this is called Widevine. It makes so much more sense than Widevine, I thought it was in the beginning. I've combined these two. They're basically unrelated, but they fit together because they're needed for Netflix and Amazon Prime and all the other services that are using HTML5 DRM video. Proprietary codecs, by default in WebEngine, when we download a standard build of WebEngine, we will not have enabled proprietary codecs. We're sticking to those codecs that are enabled in Google's open source browser Chromium, and not those enabled in their proprietary, their commercial browser, Chrome. But we can enable them. These codecs are all covered by patents, and you theoretically have to have a license from the MPEG consortium. They have said that they're not going to charge people money for it, but it's sort of like it's not something that you have a legal promise for. So it's something they might change at any point in the future and start charging money for decoding them, as long as they have the patent. But you can enable it, and theoretically it's for free to use it. So it's a compile time option. You enable it if you need to use it, or you can get a license. The second thing you need is the WebEngine plugin, WebEngine. It's a Pepper plugin, just like Flash is, and like Flash, we do not ship it. You have to get it from a third-party source, and usually the way you find it is that Chrome will download it when you go to one of these pages that use it. If you have Chrome installed and it had already downloaded, QtWebEngine will find it. But of course, if you want to make an app that is like a Netflix viewer app or something, you might want it to work even if the user doesn't have Chrome installed already. So you might want to find this plugin and ship it with your app. I've made a blog post about this sometime before summer. You can find it, and it has details about where you find these plugins, where they're downloaded to. And with that, those two things, well, yeah, Netflix works. That's cool, and Amazon Prime, and 3 other services, German services I've tried, probably also Hulu, but we don't have that in Europe, unfortunately. So let's move on to one of the more secret options. We got a lot of questions where people are complaining about the binary size of WebEngine, and they ask, why can't we disable some features? And one of the problems with disabling features is Google do not really want to support people cutting off things optionally at compile time for Chrome. So you have to do it yourself, go into all the places where they're used and disable them. So it's a painful work and leaves a bloody mess. But you might want to have it smaller anyway. You can also see here if you have debug informations, it's a 900 megabyte library, and that's actually, even though we've disabled most debug symbols, if we overwrite that and you enable all debug symbols, you get a library that is 2.4 gigabyte. It's, thank God for 64-bit architecture. But there is one trick we've enabled, and we do this automatically whenever you do a cross-build. Whenever you do build to an embedded platform, we set this automatically. But some people might want to set it also for desktop builds. You add reduce binary size to the WebEngine configuration, and that cuts up automatically 30 megabytes. It's almost half the size. And what it does is that it replaces the compile time optimization from O2 to OS. And Chrome is just using so many inline functions and so many templates that small change is huge. It's the single biggest thing you can do. There's no amount of other things that gets you this good of reduction in binary size. There's one other thing. You can try to use the system ICU and the system FFmpeg. That will take off another 3 megabytes. If you use it without reduced binary size, it will also take off 3 megabytes. It will just go from 80 to 77. So very useful for a feature. Isolated JavaScript worlds is one of the new features in 5.7 and one of the features that I strongly recommend people to use. What it does is it creates there are separate worlds of JavaScript where variables exist. A lot of variables in a JavaScript world can be global. And the problem is if you want to run a script or you have some private things that you want to inject when you rewrite a page or whatever you do in your application, you might not want potentially hostile content to access this. You could have passwords in there. It's also a big problem if you're using QWebChannel. QWebChannel is this API we have where you can inject a Q object so it's accessible from the JavaScript world. But you could, for instance, inject an object that writes to a database, and then you're collecting data from this web page and they're writing into your database, but you don't want that potentially hostile content to write into your database. So you can instead install it in an isolated world. This way, only scripts installed into the same world will be able to access it. But all of these isolated worlds, they still share the same DOM. So you can still read all of the DOM objects and change the DOM, but without having any risk of being accidentally making security holes this way. Finally, it also works even if you disable JavaScript. This is something I know a few people who are writing email clients have been extremely happy for. They want to disable JavaScript when they're showing HTML5 emails, but they still want to run a few things that changes them. And you can do this because disabling JavaScript only disables it in the main world. It disables it for the content, but not for the isolated worlds. So it's a very, very, very powerful feature. Another feature that we have had a lot of requests for and been embarrassingly absent is printing. In 5.7, we finally got an API to print to PDF. And that solved the case for some people, but it didn't solve it generally. So in 5.8, we now also have support for printing to a QPrinter. So there's generic printer API. But it only works from the WebEngine widgets API. And that is basically because QPrinter is in QWidgets. And currently there is no printing API for QDeclarative. It's also slightly absent from that. So we're waiting for QQuick to add that, and then we can also have printing there. There's one caveat. We don't have print preview. Chrome does that by using the PDFM plugin, and the PDFM plugin is unfortunately no longer that much of a plugin in Chrome. It's more of an extension, and it uses a lot of extension-specific features that we don't have yet. We're working on that. We want to have more extensions in 5.9, and hopefully we'll get the print preview along with those features. But so far we don't have print preview, but you can print and you can get PDFs. New feature in 5.8 that didn't make it to 5.7 is spell checking. Spell checking, by that I mean like continuous spell checking whenever you edit a form, when you upload things in a content field. It uses Hunspell, but it uses its own proprietary format. Google has made this BDEC format. I assume it's because the standard Hunspell format consists of two files, a .ff file and a .dic file. So they instead make a single one called a BDIC. We don't ship the dictionaries. They're quite big. Each dictionary might be 10 megabytes, so and 100 different languages is quite a lot, and they're all under different licenses. They're like, one is GPL, one is BSD, some is MIT. There are a lot of different dictionaries. But we ship a tool where you can take a dictionary, standard Hunspell dictionary, and you generate this BDEC dictionary, and then you can put it into the right folders where WebEngine will find it, and you will have spell checking. There will also be an option for using the system Hunspell on OS X on macOS, because Chrome is on macOS using the native Hunspell dictionaries. We decided to instead try to be more consistent, so we're doing the same thing across platform, but there will be a compile time option for macOS to use the system Hunspell there. Unfortunately, there's no such thing on Linux. Google hasn't done that. Another thing that's enabled in 5.8 are Greasemonkey attributes. It's also known as Chrome extensions. You can have JavaScript files that are executed on new pages, and up in these pages, we've supported that for a while, but this is an extension to these pages where you specify in the top of the file which sites they will run on. There's a lot of these scripts where people are unhappy with a certain layout on websites, and they write written scripts that changes something in these sites, like collect pages into one page, whatever. There's a lot of these scripts out there, and nowadays they're often compatible, so they work both in Firefox and Chromium, and now they will also be working in WebEngine, because they're the same attributes originally designed by Mozilla. Another new thing in 5.8 is really behind the scene. You may have heard this in some of the other talks, but the QQuick scene graph had been changed in 5.8, and that this is something we're using in WebEngine a lot. And we've had to change a lot of things, but one of the benefits of these changes means that we can now run even without OpenGL. We can actually, for the first time, run with a software rasterizer, and we can also run if you're using the DirectX 12 scene graph. In that case, it will be half accelerated. We will be telling Chrome to render unaccelerated, so it will be creating a lot of small tiles and objects that we are supposed to composite, and then we will composite them accelerated with that X12 or software rasterizer. But it means you can now run and use WebEngine without OpenGL. Yeah, I think the syntax is minus device equals software, but yeah, it's the same thing as you would do with any other QQuick app. You could previously do this with the QWebEngine QML API, but only if you had the 2D renderer. You could even do it, and before 5.7 you could do it if you had the commercial license, but it was kind of wonky and wasn't fully supported. But in 5.8 now it is. The final of the new features we have is the custom controls. This is specific to the QML API. And there's a number of dialogues and controls in HTML and JavaScript, like you can have JavaScript alerts, or you have authentication dialogues, file dialogues. And these were, in widgets, they are of course implemented using QWidgets, so they look native. But in QML, they were implemented using QQuick controls. In QQuick controls, the original one looked very much like widgets. It looked very desktop-like. And most people who use QML were often using it on embedded devices, so it looked kind of out of place, which is why we've designed this QQuick controls 2. And we have switched in 5.8 to now using QQuick controls 2. And while we did that, we now also have the option that people can implement their own. So if you have another app that wants to, where you want to show the dialog controls a different way, you want to have them somewhere else, you can now do that. You can now override that in 5.8. So yeah, I think that's it. And we could have taken questions out. There's a bunch of questions here. Who has the microphone? Where is my room monitor? There he is.
Thank you. I know you can't currently compile WebEngine statically. Is that a licensing issue, a technical issue, or both?
It's mostly a technical issue. I've done some trials to do it, and one of the problems is that the binary is 90 megabytes, and when you execute it, you suddenly have two executable that are that big, and well, it's just not designed for it right now. It's plausible we could change that, but yeah, it's not licensing.
We have a situation where we would like to use the WebEngine as a way for customers to modify the application or to create extra content. But for two reasons, we are a bit hesitant. We want to be sure of performance, so the WebView doesn't take all the CPU, and security. I mean, with all the bugs in the MPEG encoders and JPEG encoders, and yeah. Yeah. Do you have any experience with this and solutions?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you we are backporting security fixes. Whenever there's a new Chrome release, we're backporting all the security fixes. So right now with 5.7, it's based on Chromium 49, and they just released Chrome 54. But with 5.7.1 that should come out in a week or two, there will be all the security back fixes for 54. I haven't heard of any problem with the MPEG, with the decoders there, but there's often a bunch of small things that they fix in every release, usually cross-scripting exploits. What? Yeah, well, it's always hardware accelerated. As you showed here, one of the new features in 5.8 is that you can run it without hardware acceleration. It's actually, before that, it was simply impossible. It will use OpenGL rendering. It will use a lot of memory because it's Chrome, but it will usually render very efficiently.
Qt has a designer for, of course, everybody knows, for creating apps. Has there been any thought about having any type of a designer for creating web apps using web components and other types of potentially Qt components in a website? Has there been any thought of that?
No, I haven't thought of that. There's also a bit of a conflict. We like people to use QML and not HTML. Yeah, that, you know, we have dev tools that I know a lot of web designers are using. But yeah, you would have to ask somebody who works in the Qt Creator team if they want to do that. But I know it's a bit of a conflict.
Speaking about updates, Chrome comes with an update every month.
6 weeks, yeah.
6 weeks. Qt comes with an update every 6 months.
Yeah.
So do you plan to separate the projects to give updates, or we have to wait 6 months?
Well, we have the point releases hopefully every 2 months. So if they came out on time, which we're still working on, they would basically be a point release every time there's a Chrome update. And if there's a critical security fix, we would make an emergency release. So far, we've been lucky not to have a critical security fix. There have been some high priority security fixes, but they're mostly things that require there to be another hole, like where you have to have 2 before it's a problem. So that hasn't been necessary, but it's something, yeah, we're working on. But hopefully, if we get our point releases to come out on time, it shouldn't be a problem.
We've been using WebEngine with 5.6, and one of the things we've observed is that each WebEngine instance makes a connection to Pulse Audio under Linux, and Pulse Audio has a certain maximum limit of about 60 connections before it refuses connections. The WebEngine's connecting even if it's not playing audio, so ultimately we wind up with instances of WebEngine that can't play audio back. I was wondering, I noticed you made some changes to audio with tabs and things, and I was wondering if any of that changed.
No, I don't think that's changed. It's probably inherent in Chrome. If you open 60 tabs there, you would run into the same issue. We could look into it and try to fix it. One of the problems we also run into a lot is that Google does not really put their Linux port into that high priority. They're mainly maintaining it to work with Chrome OS. So sometimes they're just waiting for open source developers to fix these things on Linux for them. Any more questions?
Other questions?
Cool.
All right. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Enjoy Qt World Summit.